Sigmund Freud tends to be regarded as the man who came up with the modern idea of the human mind. Most likely you already know what I'm talking about: conscious, preconscious, and the unconscious. Further on, the conscious part is made out of ego, the unconscious from id and superego. This idea was quite revolutionary for the time, but it wasn't what people nowadays think of it. The words have remained, but the meaning hasn't. This is Freud's theory of the unconscious explained. Freud was quite the existentialist, as you'll soon see. The central idea in Freud's understanding of the human mind is the ego. Ego is the conscious part of the personality. From Latin, it simply means I. It's the part of yourself you see as yourself. Freud himself was more specific. We have formed the idea that in each individual there is a coherent organization of mental processes, and we call this his ego. Freud's central idea has its issues. People might present themselves as reliable, logical, and coherent, but the presentation is animated by a chaotic madman. The slightest amount of internal reflection will lead you to the conclusion that organization of the mind's processes is anything but coherent. Random thoughts seem to come up all the time. The second problem is that I'm not exactly sure what ego is. It's the part of the mind you're conscious of, which means that you should know where it is. But when you look for it, it's nowhere to be found. Regardless, our investigation focuses on the unconscious. I had to introduce the ego idea because Freud paradoxically derives unconscious from it. Everybody is familiar with the iceberg image of the human mind. To be fair to Freud, he didn't come up with it, and I will shortly explain why he would never make it that way. A more pertinent image of the way Freud saw the human mind would be that of Matryoshka doll. It's a wooden figure toy, and inside it there's the same figure, only smaller. In this analogy, the human mind is the whole Matryoshka. Everything outside it is the external world. The first doll is the ego, the second preconscious, and the last the unconscious. The main point is that only the outer Matryoshka, the ego, gets to interact with the external world. In Freud's view, there is no direct link between anything that even resembles unconscious and the external world. As he put it, reflection at once shows that no external vicissitudes can be experienced or undergone by the id except by the way of the ego, which is the representative of the external world to the id. Freud believed that ego was the only autonomous actor in play. Ego is the mediator between the external world and the unconscious. Let's illustrate it with a real-life example. And to stay in the theme of Freudian psychology, let's make it sexual. Imagine that you're in a workplace environment. You find out that you have a new colleague, and she's hot. But since expression of affection in the workplace is nowadays frowned upon, you repress your desires and act as if she wasn't a woman at all. In this example, you that does the repressing is the ego, the sexual desire comes from the unconscious, more precisely id part of it. Repression here is the key word, as Freud derives the unconscious from it. Thus we obtain our concept of the unconscious from the theory of repression. The repressed is the prototype of the unconscious for us. Freud saw the unconscious as consisting of two different parts. The first part is made over our lives through the process of repression. It's sort of like a hard drive full of more or less accessible memories of events that happened in the past. The second part is made out of it, which pretty much encapsulates our unconscious desires. In the unconscious there resides one more part, the superego. But quite the contrary to the understanding of any second or perhaps 20-second hand source, the superego isn't an independent part of the mind, rather it resides within id, as Freud wrote. Thus, in the id, which is capable of being inherited, are harbored residues of the existences of countless egos, and when the ego forms its superego out of id, it may perhaps only be reviving shapes of former egos. When ego forms its superego out of id, it's clear as day that Freud didn't see superego as a primary element of the human mind. Rather, it was a secondary element formed from the id. As promised, it's quite apparent now why the famous iceberg image of the human mind, to put it lightly, isn't based on Freud's ideas. Freud clearly states that ego is the only one seeing the sunlight, and that superego is a sub-branch of id made by ego somehow. Let's say that in the repressed workplace love story, you continue repressing your attraction to her. Few weeks go by, for some reason you want to compliment her book collection. You open your mouth and say, "Nice boobs, I mean books." A good old Freudian slip comes out, an awkward moment of silence ensues, and we're at the crux of the issue, the unconscious. If the unconscious didn't have agency, then we would expect ourselves to be in an utterly complete control over our actions. I mean, why do people sometimes slip up or don't act like themselves?
If you based the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works. Bitches.
If it's not you that's acting, then who is? There aren't fundamentally a lot of places to look. If you're not conscious of the actor, then it can't be in the part of your mind of which you're conscious of. The biggest problem in Freud's idea of the human mind lies in the fact that he saw the unconscious as a consequence of the ego. He obtained the idea of the unconscious through the idea of repression. Sure, it's also the part of the mind where primal desires reside, but in Freud's view these desires are blind, or to put it differently, disconnected from the external world. Further still, he said it straight up, that the superego is a creation of the ego. What he in essence is saying is that the conscious part of the mind is making the unconscious part, and that right there is logically impossible. How can you consciously create something of which you're unconscious of? Freud lived in a different era in which people's perception of themselves was changing. They were transitioning from a world where the mind was externalized to a world where internal processes were actually internal. Before Freud's time, demons, angels and the like were very much real. At least they were in the eyes of the people. Freud was surfing on a wave of changing times, and what he deserves credit for is developing an idea that there are forces beyond our control within our own mind, forces of which we are unconscious of. But he didn't go far enough. To him, the father is still the primary cause for a child to develop superego, i.e. become a moral human being. He insisted that issues in your life are caused by events that happened in your childhood. He still held rather religiously to the outside world as the only cause of internal processes, though in his new model, internal processes were at least given a rule.